Join us on Bookmark this month as we bring you some of my favorite early episodes from past seasons highlighting distinguished Catholic authors. This week we're featuring my interview with Dr. Tom Howard on his book, If Your Mind Wanders at Mass, which originally aired on September 3rd in the year 2000. And welcome to EWTN Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. We're here on a different set. We're on location for a new series that Father C.J. McCloskey is shooting on Catholic authors. But our guest is not Father McCloskey. In fact, it is a different author. This one is Dr. Thomas Howard, who is a guest on that program and an author in his own right. And today we're talking about the book, If Your Mind Wanders at Mass. Welcome, Dr. Howard. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Published by Franciscan University Press, I believe.
Yes.
And one of the books that many of the people who watch this program, watch the network, would be familiar with, I think, is the book on being Catholic. But we were talking before the show about the fact that many people don't realize that's the basis for your whole series that you did here on Treasures of Catholicism.
That's right. Yes. If they want to get the script of that, they can buy the book.
That's right. An excellent series, very well received here on the network.
Good.
And thank you so much for stopping by again. And recently we began airing the series that you've done with Dr. von Hildebrand.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Well. How was that doing that series?
Great fun. Enormous fun. I mean, Alice, Dr. von Hildebrand, is, of course, a bundle of energy and crackling intellect, and she was enthusiastic about the topic, her husband. So I had a very easy job. All I had to do was say a syllable and get her going. It was very stimulating doing it.
It really is, and it's being very well received, and we hope to do some more episodes of it in the future.
Well, the more von Hildebrand, the better.
Right, right. Well, let me ask you, Dr. Howard, has your mind wandered at Mass? Is that what brought about this book? What did bring about this book?
Yes. Probably that was at least part of it. I think I, like most other human beings, do in fact wrestle with that problem now and again, one's mind wandering at Mass. Although this wasn't my title, I think Scott Hahn made up this title.
Oh, really?
I'm no good at giving titles to books. I would have given it some inert title like the Roman Liturgy or something like that.
Not a catchy phrase.
Not one of your catchy phrases.
He likes to, in fact, if you read his books, each chapter has a little witticism attached to it.
Yes, or a title like Rome, Sweet Home.
Right, right.
What I really wanted to do was to, shall we say, unpack, or to change the metaphor, move slowly step by step through the Mass, through the liturgy, virtually every gesture from arriving at the church door and crossing oneself with holy water to genuflecting in the pew and sitting down and kneeling, right on through to Ita Missa, the Mass is over, go in peace. To try to show that the action of the Mass is, well, it is an action. It's not a program. There's no audience.
I was going to say, what's the difference there?
Well, many religious services, many non-Catholic religious services, take the form more of a program laid on for an audience, so that the special music, quote unquote, is for entertainment or entertainment/worship value. The Roman Mass is, and the liturgy from the very beginning, from the apostolic days, has been understood to be not an experience or a program, but an action. There's no audience at the Mass. There is a congregation. We are called together to do something. The Mass is something you do. It's not something you watch merely.
Though many people maybe do.
Oh yes, watch. And for many centuries, of course, it was a very common phrase to go and hear Mass. Just hear Mass. If you were under the roof when Mass was being said, that was sufficient, and you could get on with your private devotions. Vatican II, of course, and certainly John Paul II, have made tremendous efforts to draw the Catholic populace into the action of the liturgy, which is really the meaning of the word liturgy. It means the work of the people.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. Right in your introduction, you talk about the idea that there's an early record of the very prayers that were used at the Eucharistic celebration when people were worshiping, and it's worth noting that these people, most of whom were accustomed to synagogue worship. I guess the interesting part is that today, many times, it's the extemporaneous. It's what the Lord brings about us today versus this more accustomed, structured Catholic worship. And in showing what you're saying here is that the early church was very organized.
Very, very ritualistic. I think if one could single out one greatest stumbling block, besides the papacy and the doctrines of the Virgin Mary and the Mass and a few other things, but a tremendous stumbling block to non-Catholic Christians is, but how can you use this pre-canned worship every week, week after week, decade after bone-wearying decade? Where's the spontaneity of the Spirit? Where's the freedom? Where's my creativity? And so on. Well, there's a misunderstanding there, it seems to me, between the public and the private. When you do anything public repeatedly, there has to be a form. It doesn't matter whether it's the inauguration of a president or a school graduation or eating dinner at home, unless you live in a household where you just shovel it out of a can or a cereal box. But you set the table, you sit down, this happens, this happens, this happens. And the Jews in the Old Testament and the Lord, because he was a member of the synagogue, and the apostles knew nothing at all of spontaneous public worship. So the church, in forming her recurrent, regular, public, corporate worship, of course, continued on this notion of a structure, which is the liturgy. And the paradox in the thing is that it, far from being a cage or a set of clamps that cramps my freedom and creativity, it sets us all free from the shallow puddle of our own resources. And I think we all know the tedium of much extempore public prayer. It is basically a Scotch taping together of set phrases that have been used a million times before. Well, I might as well say Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax, glory be to God on high, and on earth peace, goodwill to men. We praise thee, we bless thee, we worship thee. I couldn't think that offhand. I mean, to say, for thou only art holy, thou only art the Lord, thou only art most high, Jesus Christ, with the Holy Spirit in the glory of God the Father. I couldn't think of that phrase, but you can't get any better than that.
Where did this bias come about, or when did it come
about?
Against the ritual.
Yeah. I think that there was a sense in which the little marginal trickle of Christian sects and cults down through the centuries, to some extent, had it, although even they had their own sort of liturgy. Then you could say, possibly with the preaching of the Wesleys in the 18th century, you began to get some manifestations of a little bit like some charismatic manifestations. Then with the great Protestant mass evangelists in the 19th century, most notably D.L. Moody and Charles G. Finney, you would have huge meetings, which were not church meetings. They were evangelistic meetings, but you'd have lots and lots and lots of singing and maybe testifying.
Like
and
a tent revival kind of thing?
A tent revival. And somehow or other that metamorphosed over into the weekly meeting of lots of the churches who were formed out of those movements. And I think together with that, this wish for spontaneity and the immediate, the unplanned, this notion that a prayer is not authentic unless it's right off the top of my head right now, or right out of my heart right now. If I say, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, that can't be real because that's pre-canned, and I'm just repeating
Wrote.
it,
Right.
according to that. I think the other big reason you asked is because we live in an epoch, the latter 20th century, which has gone absolutely mad on the notion of self-expression and letting it all hang out and me wanting to express myself. Well, that's not what's going on in worship. Me expressing myself may be one legitimate kind of activity. It is not worship.
Do you think that comes out of the me and Jesus kind of concept?
Yes. I think when you have a recipe or a formula which has me, Jesus, and the Bible basically as its three props or pillars or three ingredients in the recipe, then when you come together, you have a lot of me's, Bibles, and you have one Jesus, of course, but, well, hey, I want to say my piece, or I want to tell you what the Lord's been doing for me this week, or I want to well, here, let's hear it from everybody, or whoever has a prayer, stand up and pray. And I'm sure the Lord accepts that.
Right.
I mean, he's very gracious to all of us. We Catholics are not very good at singing sometimes, but I think that what is being missed there is the difference between the public and the private. Another example of it would be the contemporary, very widespread practice of couples writing their own vows for weddings, and very often what you get is a certain intimacy in their effort to be authentic.
Right.
They've stumbled across the line into what ought to exist just between them, and we are embarrassed. We're the congregation. We are the witnesses. We ought not to witness the groom saying exactly that to his bride, or this. The form sets you free from that. Wilt thou have this woman to be thy? I mean, the necessary things are being said. We don't have to make them up on the spur of the moment. The audience doesn't have to. The congregation doesn't have to think, oh dear, what's coming next?
Right.
And so on. That's the genius of ritual, of liturgy.
Do you see any connection, or is it a stretch to even say in education today, the whole idea of the loss of the benefit of memorization or of things that are learned deeply?
Yes. I think the whole effort, which has some sprinklings of good in it, but the effort to communicate the idea that some piece of information or some data isn't real unless it springs from my experience or something, so that grinding through the multiplication table or grinding through the dates of the American Revolution and everything, or we all had to memorize, I guess you did, the Declaration of Independence, and the first paragraph of the Constitution. All of that stuff, the notion is you're pounding stuff into kids' heads, whereas they ought to be spontaneously coming up.
But as you said before, it's freeing, because when you know it, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think about it. You can focus on other things.
The form is the greatest liberation there is. We see it, I think, in small children who have been taught from the earliest age how to stand up, look at a visitor, put out their hand and say, how do you do?
Right.
There's none of the sort of, what do I do now, or hiding behind the mother's skirts, and so on. The well-trained child has got a formula. He does not have to think of anything to say. He doesn't have to think of anything new. He doesn't have to be self-conscious. He has been taught the form, and lo and behold, the form, which would seem to be a grid, is liberating.
Speaking of forms, we have to take a break. The show has a format as well. We're speaking here with Dr. Thomas Howard about his book, which is entitled If Your Mind Wanders at Mass, published by Franciscan University Press. Much more with Dr. Howard right after this. And welcome back to this special edition of Bookmark. I am Doug Keck, your host, here with Dr. Thomas Howard, speaking to him about his book, If Your Mind Wanders at Mass, something we can all relate to, I think, published by Franciscan University Press. Dr. Howard, in your book you say it is often supposed that genuine ardor calls for spontaneity. Doesn't it?
Sometimes, yes. I think ardor or zeal or warmth or being carried away can indeed spring from spontaneity. But when you approach something which is recurrent, like Christian worship, it should be daily, of course, in me individually, and certainly weekly, and goes on decade after decade for me, century after century for the church, then spontaneity runs dry almost immediately. And so how do we preserve and foster ardor? And it seems to me that the root of the matter here is a question of, and it is a question of learning. It's a question of increasingly learning to enter into the thing outside of me, which is there, not relating everything to myself, not everlastingly saying, I don't resonate to that, or I don't turn on to that, or something. It's the other way around. I am facing reality. All right, what does it ask of me? And on your question of can you have ardor without spontaneity?
Right.
I think one very easy example that anybody from any sector of Christendom could relate to would be, let's say, the singing of the Messiah. And here it is, Handel's pre-canned music, every violin playing exactly the notes on the page, the conductor demanding exact obedience from the chorus and orchestra. And you'd think, well, there's a recipe for sheer boredom and death. It's going to kill all ardor, and yet we come to, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and honor and glory. And you'd have to be a hard-hearted person not to be profoundly moved by that strict order. There's a very simple example in Catholic piety, and that's the Rosary. People who are unfamiliar with Catholicism or have never themselves been Catholics very often think, well, that's just mumbo jumbo. It's just like turning Tibetan prayer wheels or something. You're just repeating a lot of things. But for the Catholic who is schooled in this and who has given his mind to this, it is, as Romano Guardini phrases it, it is a method of tarrying in the presence of, one at a time, of the 15 divine mysteries. And of course, repetition of words is the closest we mortals who have to live in time can get to the eternal. We have to say it over and over again. Anybody is used to saying Alleluia, 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 or Holy, 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 over and over. With the Rosary, what you're doing is tarrying in the presence of the Annunciation, of the Visitation, of the Nativity, and the words, I don't want to sound irreverent, but they're almost a set of ball bearings that your mind can find repose in as you place yourself there, saying, you know, I want to be one of the ones who is greeting this mystery with my whole heart.
You mentioned in the book the idea, kind of the connection with Catholic worship from Jewish worship. What do you say to an evangelical who says, well, that all changed at Pentecost? That's the perfect example of when we went from this kind of tired old format with rote prayers to spontaneous infilling of the Holy Spirit, and that's what we should be. That's what the early Christians were doing.
Well, the shortest and most accurate and really the most charitable answer is, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. The morning of Pentecost didn't last forever, and the morning of Pentecost was not a church service. It was an evangelistic meeting, and the whole
like
rabble,
a tent revival, almost in a sense.
Tent revival, sure. Sawdust trail and all. That was not the pattern for the church's regular coming together to celebrate the divine mysteries as the church moved out into the long haul of history. And what the church began to do, you cannot find in the New Testament. Now in Acts, you find out that the Christians met for for fellowship, the apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread and prayers. But it doesn't say how those were organized or what they did about them. But in the letters of the men who were taught by John and taught by Paul and taught by Peter, you discover, my goodness, Here is some very wording that I've heard in my own day. The letters will say, and then the president of the Eucharist, meaning the presider, will say. And the prayers are essentially the same as what you hear in the Mass now. They rehearse God's mighty acts of salvation in our behalf, and then when the fullness of time came, you sent your Son, Jesus Christ, who died, and that's still the Mass. And the Christians, the very first evidence we have of their worship was that they were following an unalterable ritual. They weren't just getting together for a hoedown.
Right. Well, before you became Catholic in the past, what was your perspective on the ceremonies, the rituals of Catholicism?
Well, I'm a bad one to ask because, of course, I was in a sector of Christendom which, on the one hand, you could say, by Catholic standards, it would seem a little spontaneous, and yet the church that we went to, I mean, a very, very, very simple church, a Baptist-type church. Actually, what we didn't know, we would have said, oh, but the Catholics have this unbroken ritual. Never occurred to us that we did too. Exactly the same thing happened in exactly the same sequence. The minister walked down the aisle. I think he would say a short prayer. Now we will sing hymn number so-and-so. Now we'll read the scripture and so on. It was an exact ritual. In college, when I went to a brethren assembly, which is supposed to be totally unstructured, the ritual never, never, never varied, even though it was supposed to be open to the Spirit.
But why didn't someone see that at that time? Why would they not realize that it was their own ritual?
I don't know. That is an odd question, and it's a paradox.
Right.
But I think most people from non-ritualistic churches, that is, people who are not Roman or Orthodox or Anglican or Lutheran, will say, oh, that's too structured, that's too much of a grid, it's going to kill you. You know, we have to have a little bit more spontaneity. And you say, right, let's see, what do you do in your church service? I mean, if somebody got up and suggested a little bit of ping pong, or somebody said, well, let's fry an egg to the glory of God now, everybody would say, no, that's out of order.
That's inappropriate.
What order?
Right.
Disorder. And so on. I myself would have to confess that from my earliest memories, I yearned with an almost desperate yearning for the liturgy. I didn't know what it was I wanted.
Right.
But I used to look at my mother, who had been an Episcopalian in her youth. I used to look at her prayer book and almost tremble looking at it and reading the prayers. And when I first went to a ritualistic service, which was in the Episcopal Church, it broke my heart. I cried for 3 days.
The center of Christian life is your chapter 1 in here. You talk about the Mass. You talk about the different names that we call the Mass: the Eucharist, Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper, the Mass. And you mentioned that you see that as suggesting that rich depths of the Mass itself.
Yes.
How so?
Well, if you take the different names, you do begin to realize the tremendous density of substance, and we'd have to bring in the word mystery in the Mass. Mass itself, in one sense, is the least successful. It just came from the old Latin word, ita missa est, you are sent out, the ritual is over, and they just took that and that became Mass. Liturgy is a first century word, and it's Greek and means the work of the people. What was the work of the people? The celebration of the Eucharist. Eucharist means thank you in Greek, and it is the offering of praise and thanksgiving to God, which of course is singularly and uniquely manifested at the cross, which is made present to us in the Mass. And the Lord's table, that's the Last Supper. We're there at the Last Supper.
And all of those
are
rolled into
We're at Golgotha, we are at the Last Supper, we're at the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven, we are in the heart of God before the creation, when the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world was there in the Holy Trinity.
This is and I don't want to say this negatively, this is a nice little book, and it's a nice read. You can really go right through it, and you get a lot out of it. What was the genesis of putting it? Was this a book you sat down and wrote? Was this a series of talks that you? What really led you to do this?
It was twofold. When I was an Episcopalian, I had written a similar, much shorter book about the Anglican liturgy. It was in the old days of Xerox, and not Xerox, but what do you call it? Mimeograph, or that purple stuff. What was that? I forget what they called that, but anyway, mimeograph, just for my own parish. And that
Dittos was another name.
Ditto. That got published. Then when I became a Roman Catholic, I realized I had not done that for the Roman liturgy. But this was a series of talks that I gave at the Franciscan University in Steubenville.
Okay. Okay. Interesting also, we mentioned all those names. Sometimes when you hear, it used to always be the Mass, and then sometimes you hear Eucharist, and sometimes there seems to be almost a confusion between Eucharist relating specifically to Holy Communion versus Eucharist as the Mass versus even some expressions like we are Eucharist.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to the playing a little maybe fast and loose with some of these terms?
Yeah. Well, you're talking to a very, very, very stuffy traditionalist here. I would be happy if just for general usage and for designating the Roman liturgy, we called it the Mass.
Right.
The Mass. It has the weight and the honor and the dignity of history and tradition behind it. And the other words are certainly good, but they can become trendy and therefore superficial.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. You're never superficial. Thank you. A great book.
Thank you.
If Your Mind Wanders at Mass, again, Dr. Thomas Howard, published by Franciscan University Press. I'm Doug Keck, inviting you to join me next time right here on EWTN Bookmark.